Welcome to Catastrophes. This is a podcast about disasters, why disasters happen, and the factors that make them happen. Today we're taking a slightly different approach and discussing FEMA, or the Federal Emergency Management Agency in the U.S. If you haven't heard, FEMA will be undergoing a full review, kind of looking at the different administrative parts, its functions, its mandate, and how much it costs the U.S. government each year. Today we're going to discuss what is the role of FEMA when we look at mitigation, preparedness, and response, and then also what is their role in reducing vulnerability, which is the core theme of this podcast. So with that, the intent of exploring these disasters and the ones we're going to discuss as case studies today is not to demean or diminish the experiences of people who have faced these traumatic events, but rather explore, question, critique, and ask why these events are happening the way they do. So, with that, let's begin. So, welcome in. Today, we are discussing the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA for short, in the USA, and how FEMA is run, how its mandates, and basically the things that make up FEMA. I'm recording today's episode slightly earlier than the occasional Thursday, so there may be some shifts or movement in how the approach to reviewing FEMA, auditing FEMA is going, just basically for people's reference and awareness. But really today I want to discuss a few elements of FEMA and how it's operated and run. Number one, we're going to look at the task that the U.S. government has in reviewing and what they're hoping to get out of. And I'm hoping to provide a little bit more information about that because I was able to find a good source. Next, we're going to look at what FEMA's role is. And it has a number of pretty significant mandates and policies, which the states and cities have effectively created policies and procedures and trained around. And then after that, we'll look at a few events where we actually see firsthand the role of FEMA. To begin our discussion, it's relevant to hear the initial comments about the quote-unquote review of FEMA. So on Monday, February 11th, U.S. House Speaker Mike Johnson said at a press conference that FEMA and its operations, its apparatuses will be reviewed. But he did not say anything about the elimination of FEMA itself. Those comments came from Trump and others. What Johnson did say is that various departments and agencies within the U.S. government are all being considered for evaluation, and they're looking to, quote unquote, make the government more efficient and effective, and to limit the size and scope of government. So, at its heart, Johnson and Trump and a number of other Republican candidates, what they are looking to do is let states run the response. And this is really an interesting comment, and it appears a number of times by various representatives, but it's somewhat misguided because states do run the response. They only request to FEMA when they are overwhelmed. So we're going to get into what FEMA's role is and whether or not it leads a response or not. It doesn't. And let's jump into FEMA's role now. So if FEMA didn't exist, there would be several basically apparatuses missing, which is why total elimination of the agency would just be, there would be a lot of gaps. And if there were any sort of disaster, there would be a lot of funding gaps and a lot of response and logistics gaps. So I've broken it down. FEMA has probably about like 20 to 30 different roles. It's a massive agency with thousands of people working for it. But at its core, FEMA does about 5 things. Number one, they coordinate federal resources. And this is a really important point. The United States is a large country, and the logistics of getting resources from one area to another is quite the job. So FEMA will basically get one resource, whether it's critical water supplies for relief, meals, restoring power, conducting search and rescue, organizing people to go fix something. That's one of FEMA's mandates. The second is quite a large role, and it has come under controversy lately, and I think it's worth discussing. The second is providing financial assistance after a disaster occurs. So FEMA distributes billions of dollars in disaster relief to help people, businesses, and then local municipalities after a disaster. We're going to go through some of the numbers in a bit, but this is just a high-level overview of what FEMA does. Third, FEMA provides logistical support. So there's a number of trained staff FEMA has, and they will go and augment some of these state responders. So this is a really important distinction. The states still run the response. They accept help from the federal government, and then they also accept help from, municipalities and such. But basically, FEMA is this overarching support system that allows states to respond faster. And I think the first time we really saw sort of a shift and a blame of FEMA, number one, has been in a few hurricanes, or the experiences of people who have gone through some of these hurricanes and then had to blame somebody. And FEMA is a very easy target to blame. There's a number of hurricanes where, first, Hurricane Sandy, 2012, Hurricane Houston, 2017, Hurricane Katrina, 2005, where FEMA was in a support role. But when you see FEMA, and many people don't understand the purpose of this assistance and providing logistical support and helping coordinate a response, they become an easy target to blame because they're not actually the direct people taking over a response or a recovery. So there's a lot of misinformation. And again, I would say it largely is attributed to Hurricane Sandy and Hurricane Harvey in 2017. Dr. Selin from the Arizona State University has a really good article on the conversation about this misinformation and how FEMA has really been kind of the target of this misinformation. And there's a big misunderstanding about their role. So those are FEMA's 3 primary functions, I would say. Let's move to some of the other pillars of emergency management and where FEMA plays a role. The first is mitigation, and I think it's a really interesting discussion. So again, going back to Mike Johnson's comments about FEMA, well, we want less government, so on and so on. The role of FEMA with mitigation, and mitigation is any sort of structure, building, any sort of implemented project that can help reduce the risk of a single hazard or disaster. So a great example that we see all across the U.S. is flood walls, flood barriers alongside rivers, and then also on the ocean coastlines. What FEMA does is they have teams to help. They have teams basically to help manage these projects, to support and augment, not to build them themselves. But then they also run a flood mitigation assistance grant program. So over the course of 30 years, as of 2024, this project or this mitigation assistance grant program has selected 197 applications, and they have paid out $715 million in federal cost sharing for grants. So there's a lot of jargon here. I'll break it down for you because this policy is really complex. But basically, states have an obligation to mitigate a lot of the disasters that are happening to them already. So states actually have a lot of agency. They will choose what hazard is more severe to them and more likely to happen, and they will do something about it. What the federal government, what FEMA does, is they will pay for a portion of the project, of the mitigation project. And that's a really important distinction again, because it puts states first, and they actually have the ability to control what they're doing, and they get to choose the mitigation strategy as a whole. When we look at this flood mitigation assistance grant program, floods are one of the greatest risks for the U.S. Large rivers, Mississippi, along with coastlines, are really prone to any sort of flooding. And there's a number of secondary effects that go along with this. So mitigation, there's a bit of a cost sharing help, especially with floods, but then the federal government is also looking to help states, not augment. And again, coming back to the concept of vulnerability, FEMA, one of its roles is assisting in these mitigation projects and mitigation as a whole, and promoting the awareness of various hazards. So they do a lot of work in terms of this preparedness, of ensuring that people have a better understanding of what is coming. But that is also a state and a local responsibility as well. So, but it is augmented and assisted by FEMA as well. The Hazard Mitigation Assistance Grant is another program that FEMA runs, and they do cost sharing, and they provide grants to municipalities and to states to implement mitigation strategies. So in fiscal year 2022, $1.78 billion was awarded in hazard mitigation assistance grants to states, tribes, and territories, where mitigation actions would reduce risk and help build climate resilience. So let's just run through some of these numbers. 1.78 billion. Again, we talked about the flood mitigation assistance program. $148 million was for the flood mitigation assistance. 19 million was actually for the hazard mitigation grant program for post-fire. So wildfires in western states, particularly that year, were difficult. 10%, or 170 million, was for pre-disaster mitigation grant programs. So where we talk about reducing the risk before a disaster happens, actually saving money in the long term, this is a program that does a lot of that. Then we have the largest one, Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which is 43% of that 1.78 billion, $764 million worth. And there's a number of projects we'll run through with them. But the next largest is the Public Assistance Mitigation Funding, which is $601 million, and then Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, $79 million. So the largest grant program, the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, is FEMA's program where they provide funding to states, local, tribal, and territorial governments so they can develop hazard mitigation plans, rebuild in a way that reduces or mitigates future disaster losses in their community. And these funding grants are typically available after a president declares a disaster. So it's kind of an interesting program itself because it is for post-disaster. And they're looking to help rebuild better, which is a concept that Bill Clinton famously coined in 2004 after the Boxing Day tsunamis. And it's really interesting because a large portion of year-to-year spending on disasters is through this grant program. And I suspect most people don't know what it actually does. But again, all it's looking to do is just provide funding so states, local governments, territorial governments, tribal governments can develop hazard mitigation plans and rebuild so that there's less damages in the future. This is basically a recovery fund as well as a mitigation fund. When we talk about FEMA's actions in preparedness, it is somewhat similar to mitigation, where they are doing a lot of grant funding. There's sometimes non-disaster grant funding where they're looking to help local emergency responders respond to weapons of mass destruction, which is actually from FEMA's Homeland Security page. And again, that kind of funding comes out of FEMA's overall budget and their mandate. They also actively promote ready.gov website, which not only helps regular citizens be prepared for a disaster in their local area, but it also assists and provides information to businesses. And they have a lot of really good information. They also do a lot of the training too. And those trainings can be so significant. So that's mitigation, that's preparedness. Let's talk about the big one, which is recovery. I mentioned before that FEMA provides financial assistance after a disaster. So as of February 3rd, 2025, for the 2024 storm season, so that includes Hurricane Milton, Hurricane Helene, Hurricane Debby, they provided individuals for each of the storms. Hurricane Milton, they provided $1.4 billion of financial assistance. For Hurricane Helene, $416 million. For Hurricane Debby, $112 million. And this isn't just to individuals, it's also to businesses and local governments to help them recover. So it's not only that immediate first money that many people got right after the disaster, but it's that secondary funding as well. So they do a lot of cost sharing, but they also do a lot of assistance and augmentation of some support roles. They will provide guidance and leadership and a little bit of oversight on how to build, sustain, and improve any sort of recovery. And they oftentimes operate on saving lives, reducing suffering, stabilizing the risk, and then protecting property when it comes to and dealing with the next hazard as well. So their recovery is quite large. But it also relates to what is one of the probably more significant programs in my eyes, which is the National Flood Insurance Program. The NFIP, or National Flood Insurance Program, has over 4.7 million policyholders across the U.S. who have insurance coverage in areas that are considered prone to flood, but also in areas that are in floodplains, and then just areas that don't see a lot of insurance coverage for any sort of floods. The difficulty is floods can actually happen anywhere, and it's not only flood water from a river right by you, it's also the rainwater or any sort of rainfall which can cause a flood. FEMA's stat is that 1 inch of floodwater can cause up to $25,000 of damage, which is a relatively fair estimate, in my opinion. It's probably more like $40,000 now. But anyways, most homeowners' insurance do not include any sort of flood coverage. A flood insurance policy is something that's separate. So most people have to buy it in addition to their regular home insurance. And there's a chance that it doesn't, if you do have flood insurance, it won't cover all your damages. So the National Flood Insurance Program is basically a replacement for a lot of private insurances that used to want to cover floods. But again, and in previous episodes we've talked about this, but there is a huge shift across North America where private insurance companies are starting to move away from some particular hazards, including floods, wildfires, hurricanes. For floods particularly, less and less insurance companies are wanting to insure them because there's just no profits in them for private insurers. So that leaves millions of homes across America prone to any sort of damages. And you might say, like, well, a lot of those people chose to live there. The difficult part is sometimes you don't recognize that you do live in a floodplain until it's too late. Sometimes you're at risk of being flooded via rainwater, and the shift in some of our climate around North America has actually made some areas more prone to rainfall and more intense rainfall, meaning that a flood might not actually come from the river. It might come from, the sky, rainfall. So there's a huge gap in insurance for floodplains and flood management and floods in general. So 4.7 million people have insurance with basically flood insurance with FEMA. And that's a really important key function and something that FEMA has had on their radar. So a lot of information I've thrown out in the last 20 minutes. Let's quickly recap some of it and then work through an example. Effectively, FEMA, its role and responsibility is not to lead a response, not to lead a recovery, not to lead any sort of mitigation or prevention, which are the 4 pillars of disaster management, but rather it's a government system that helps augment and helps states function, and it gives them support. So a lot of the comments by the U.S. House Speaker and by others made by U.S. politicians are somewhat off base when they say that, well, FEMA is leading and taking over the response. That's not necessarily true. FEMA helps augment a lot of these responses, recoveries, preventions, mitigations, and it offers a lot of grant programs that assist states in getting funding and being able to do things that they want to do. So there is a lot of autonomy for states already. The difficulty is when we talk about states like Florida or Louisiana that have yearly disasters, hurricanes and floods primarily. And as we're starting to see, California with their wildfire season. These 3 states, mostly Florida and Louisiana, would likely be the biggest victim if there was no FEMA. They draw a lot of finances and funding from grant programs that FEMA offers. The secondary part to all of this is if states did have to have their own emergency management corps that took on the functions of FEMA, it would cost most states too much money where they wouldn't be able to actually operate it. There's actually a good quote by Lynn Budd, who's the director of the Wyoming Office of Homeland Security. And he said, states don't have the capacity to build or handle a disaster every single year. And part of what he was getting at is access to FEMA prevents or allows states to basically save money and cost share from each other. And that was always the idea or one of the core tenets of FEMA and, basically a large federal government is that some states are going to need more assistance than others. Some states are in a place where they are going to be hit by more disasters than others, and they need more assistance. And we also have to consider, Wyoming not having a lot of capacity to do everything that they need to do, but also the states like Texas as well, who have their own power grid and have their own power infrastructure and water infrastructure, and them being reliant on FEMA for many disasters over the last 10 years. So there's a lot of challenges with any sort of abolishing of FEMA. But I think with the state of a lot of U.S. states being hit consistently year after year with reoccurring disasters, it's forcing a lot of states to have to rethink, how do we do mitigation? How do we prepare our people? And FEMA offers a social safety net basically for people, businesses, and the governments to fall back on if there is something unexpected that happens. Again, recapping some of FEMA's core things that they do. Mitigation, they provide a lot of the grants needed for many local governments and large governments and what they want to do for any sort of reduction of risk or reduction of a hazard. They help coordinate federal resources. They also help provide logistical support. And this is an important distinction. They do not lead any sort of response. Their mandate is to help augment any sort of response. But they do get a bad rep due to the fact that, well, they're the federal government and they're not actually leading anything. They don't have the mandate to. They have a mandate to help and support the state. Finally, one of their biggest roles is in recovery. They provide a lot of financial assistance, not only to individuals, businesses, but they also do the secondary work of flood insurance. Over 4.7 million homes have flood insurance with the National Flood Insurance Program. So I think that's relevant, and I was able to synthesize a whole bunch of information, and I appreciate you sticking with me today. And I hope you enjoyed this episode. Not the typical reviewing of a disaster and some of the ongoing vulnerabilities, but rather what is one of the central government apparatuses or agencies in America and what is their actual role. I know that it's sometimes difficult to find information that is relevant, and I hope that this podcast gave you a little bit more insight into what FEMA actually does and their value. So with that, if you enjoyed today's episode, please like, subscribe, provide a review on Apple Podcast or Spotify. If you're on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want a disaster reviewed or you have a question about any sort of disaster management, just disasters in general, I'm always open to talking about them and answering them. You can reach me at catastrophepodcast@gmail.com, or also I'm getting more involved in social media. You can reach me there as well. So that is all I got for today. Later.